Too Much Information is a production of iHeart Radio. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Too Much Information, the show that brings you the secret history and little-known fascinating facts behind your favorite music, movies, TV shows, and more. We're two guys with too much free time on our hands. My name's Jordan Runtagh.
And I'm Alex Heigl. And today we're taking a look at Marvin Gaye's undisputed magnum opus, What's Going On, which recently turned 50 years old. Rolling Stone put it at the top of their semi-regularly updated greatest albums of all time list in 2020, which felt appropriate considering we were at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests, and it's an album that has a lot to say about those kinds of issues and still feels eerily and sadly relevant. And it's such a weirdly sprawling, ambitious record for that time period in Motown. Super personal for Marvin. I don't know, what more can you say about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the first soul concept album done, and it's just done on the symphonic scope with...
Could you call it prog soul?
Prog soul, yeah. Not enough organ on it. Not enough keyboards. I mean, it's just got these like incredibly sophisticated orchestrations and jazz arrangements. And yeah, like you said, I mean, lyrically, it works on a global level, tackling social issues, but also it taps into Marvin Gaye's intense inner pain around this period.
Marvin Gaye had so much pain.
So much pain.
And some of it was Berry Gordy's fault.
Yes. Amazingly, and we'll get into this later, Motown chief Berry Gordy thought that it was the worst thing he'd ever heard in his life, which is
rude.
Very rude. Very rude. He was ready to toss it on the scrap heap, and the world almost never heard What's Going On, but thankfully,
Stevie Wonder came to the rescue.
Yes. We'll talk more
as with most
things in this god-awful world. Stevie Wonder made it better. We'll talk more about how Stevie Wonder saved the day, Marvin Gaye's unorthodox pre-singing rituals, and how a series of accidents led to the most iconic part of What's Going On. Here's everything you didn't know about Marvin Gaye's classic, What's Going On. So, it's the dawn of the 70s.
And Marvin Gaye was at a crossroads.
Right. Yes. It's amazing. Every one of these episodes, we find our artist at a crossroads. And he's poised to record What's Going On, arguably his crowning achievement, not to mention an incredible string of records like Let's Get It On, and I Want You, Here My Dear. This is arguably his crowning period. And it's interesting when you consider that Marvin Gaye was about to abandon his music career at the dawn of the 70s and try out for the NFL.
This is such a sweet story. It's so pure. He was just like, I can do this. I can join the NFL.
It's like Rocky. Yeah. So, I mean, let's get into Marvin's head, which is a scary place right now, and figure out why he was ready to. Because at this point, at the dawn of the 70s, he's Motown's biggest male star. I mean, I heard it through the grapevine, was a #1 smash 2 years earlier. I mean, he's got a lot of hits under his belt. So, but this is a really rough time in his life. His duet partner, Tammy Terrell, that he'd sung Ain't No Mountain High Enough, Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing, You're All I Need to Get By, all these great songs, had just died. And given his troubled relationships with, well, everyone, but especially women, it seemed like his relationship with Tammy Terrell was like one of his few uncomplicated friendships in his life. And they were incredibly close as people. And as musicians, she was a veteran of James Brown's band, so she pushed him to greater heights on stage. So they were really, really close. And during a performance in October of 1967, Tammy collapsed into his arms on stage, and she was rushed to a hospital, and doctors found a brain tumor, and she died in March of 1970, and she was just 24. And this absolutely devastated Marvin. I mean,
I found a while back online there was stems for the Motown stuff. Like you can find isolated tracks of them. I'm just getting goosebumps talking about it because like you listen to their vocal takes on Ain't No Mountain High Enough. I mean, every performance on that song is a masterpiece. Like the bass line is beautiful. The drum parts are incredible. Even the little like hand percut tambourine parts are amazing. But man, the two of them on that song, like those vocal takes are, they pushed each other to be so much better than the sum of their parts.
Yeah, and they were really close. And so her death, I mean, you could argue that he really never got over it. It sent him into a deep state of depression, or you could just say exacerbated his depression that he lived with constantly.
Yeah.
And this depression fueled his worsening cocaine abuse. around this time, he actually attempted suicide, but the gun was wrestled away from him by Motown chief Berry Gordy's father, of all people. So this was a really, in late 69, early 70, this was a rough time in his life, and he was considering leaving the music industry for good. And he'd seen how Motown had really kind of destroyed the lives of people like Florence Ballard from the Supremes and Paul Williams of the Temptations, both of whom would die early deaths in the early 70s. So he was thinking of getting out. And at this point, he'd befriended members of the Detroit Lions, the hometown NFL team. And they sort of coaxed him out of his, darkened coke den and convinced him to go outside, get some exercise. And this sort of encouragement morphed very quickly into Marvin's brief but passionate obsession with trying out for the NFL. And I guess the Detroit Lions coach had made like a jokey comment at some like post-game celebration to Marvin, like, oh yeah, work out, you can try out for us next season.
And the light went on in Marvin's head.
And yeah, he took it seriously, and he was, I guess, unbothered by the fact that he was 31 years old and he'd never played the game before. But again, he was hanging out with actual NFL players, and they gave him tips on training and what they were doing in their preseason workouts. So he ran like 6 miles a day and did weight training at East Michigan University and learned all the pass plays. I guess he even quit smoking. And he worked at this for like 6 months and became absolutely convinced that he was going to make the team, despite a chorus of his Motown friends telling him that, it takes more than 6 months of weight training and running to get into the NFL.
But he had heart.
But he had heart. I mean, he looked the part too. Like he bulked up to like 200 pounds. I mean, he looked good. But I mean, the real problem was nobody in the Lions management was willing to risk the repercussions of like injuring a national treasure and most likely being sued by Berry Gordy, who would absolutely sue someone into the ground for this. So in the end, the Lions didn't let him try out. And Marvin didn't take the news well at all. And he insisted to his dying day that he could have been a contender on the field. One of his friends at Motown said he was crushed when they told him he couldn't play, but he would have been crushed for real if he had played. Sometimes life is like that.
It's true. So the Lions running back, Mel Farr, told ESPN at one point, he said, Marvin wasn't a gifted athlete.
Oh.
Marvin was a great singer. You know how the things that you really can't do, you either stick with it or try something else? That's kind of who Marvin was. But he was sincere about it.
Oh,
I know. So sweet.
So Marvin begrudgingly goes back to his superstar day job at Motown. Like, oh, shucks. Yeah. So he stays on Motown, but he starts rebelling around this time from the show-busy veneer that Motown demanded. He stopped wearing ties and started wearing track suits, and he grew a beard, which at the time apparently wasn't common for black men. And he had a quote years later. He said, "Black men weren't supposed to look overtly masculine. I'd spent my entire career looking harmless, and the look no longer fit. I wasn't harmless. I was pissed off at America." Rightfully so. This was just after the shooting of Martin Luther King in 1968 and Bobby Kennedy later that year, the violence in the streets of Detroit in 1967, the riots in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention, the murder at Altamont, Charles Manson, the murder at Kent State University in May of 1970. All these things are going on. The streets are on fire, and this sets the stage for what's going on in the summer of 1970.
I think it's in the Motown movie, Standing in the Shadows, about the session players that there were 3 guitarists in a lot of these, and the one white guy, and he talked about they called themselves the Oreo guitar section because it was the two black guys were seated on either side of the white guy. But they talked about during those riots, they had to like smuggle him out of the black neighborhood in Detroit.
Wow.
Like I think they threw a coat or something over his head and like tossed him into a car, and because they were like, if they see like a white guy out on these, like you'll be torn limb from limb.
Wow.
So yeah, such is the climate of Detroit at this point. The song itself was originally written by Obie Benson of the Four Tops, who had witnessed cops in riot gear beating up some kids during a protest, which is either in San Francisco or People's Park in Berkeley in May of '69. And Benson fleshed out an early version of the song with songwriter Al Cleveland, who wrote I Second That Emotion, some other great Motown songs, and took it to the rest of the Four Tops, who passed. They were not interested in it. He said, "My partners told me it was a protest song. I said, no, man, it's a love song about love and understanding. I'm not protesting. I want to know what's going on." But they never really understood what was happening. So I guess he took it to Joan Baez next, who
Interesting.
also passed.
Also interesting. That's surprising.
I love Joan Baez, but a Joan Baez version of this song would have been so like
very different meaning. Very different. Yeah.
So then Benson and Al Cleveland were playing golf with Marvin Gaye.
As one does.
Not football.
Yeah, at this point, he's like, never show me a football again. What's another sport? What's the least football-like sport there is? Bowling? No, it's too nice a day. All right, golf.
So this song came up, and I guess they played him a demo once they got back to their house. And that was what he was searching for. Marvin was affected by the war in Vietnam. Obviously, all the horrible events you just reeled off. And he would say later, I realized I had to put my own fantasies behind me if I wanted to write songs that would reach the souls of people. I wanted them to take a look at what was happening in the world. Basically becoming a political artist. The whole thing about Motown, especially right in this era, is that Gordy's whole thing was like, you guys have to look super polished, non-threatening. Didn't he have he ran a charm school?
It was a polishing
for them?
Or a finishing school, yeah.
Yeah, so...
And then Marvin started showing up. I mean, we'll get into the whole tangled, almost Oedipal relationship between Marvin Gaye and Berry Gordy a little later. But Marvin started showing up at press conferences and stuff with Malcolm X's biography and Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver and stuff, poking out of his jacket or his pants or something, very obvious, not even so silent protests about where he was at. Because, they would literally teach you how to speak. I mean, it was like a charm school.
And he said, so for the first time, I really felt like I had something to say. But that something did not include a question mark. One of the changes he made was to take the question mark out that Benson had in the title.
Because he said the song was no longer a question.
Yeah, the song was a statement. And, as Marvin Gaye is entitled to do, he rejiggered the melody and reworked the lyrics, which reflect on his brother Frank's experience as a soldier in Vietnam. He would get these letters home from Frankie and about these war atrocities. And, Marvin really took to heart, apparently, the description of children eating out of garbage cans.
The idea of kids living on what the rest of us deem unworthy and throw away, that really stuck with him. And that became, I think something that really crystallized for him what he wanted this song to be about and touch on.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it in this kind of context, it's almost like The Things They Carried, or one of these other great networks of narrative war fiction, because it is such a visual song.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what Marvin's, I think, great gift to the song was. I mean, aside from taking the question mark out of the title, which absolutely did change its meaning, and tweaking the melody a bit, he made it more of a story than a song. You're absolutely right. I mean, that's it's an incredibly visual piece of music. Interesting to note that Marvin apparently never replied to any of these letters home from his brother Frankie, and that was always a sore spot for his brother.
Yeah,
well, yeah, I mean, I guess none of the GIs believed him that he was Marvin Gaye's brother, and he kept saying no, he's gonna write back and I'll prove it that Marvin Gaye's actually my brother, and he never did. But I guess Frankie forgave him when he heard the final version of What's Going On, which he said was so personal and heartfelt that it made him weep when he first heard it. So he realized that he'd actually gotten through to his brother, and even though he hadn't responded to his letters, he wasn't being ignored.
And they did patch things up. I mean, by the mid-'70s, he was appearing on stage. Apparently, Marvin Gaye used to mess with people by putting Frankie on stage instead of him, just to punk the audiences. And
they look very similar, yeah.
Yeah, and he's on, he does Got to Give It Up, sings on that, and apparently did soundtrack work. So, yeah, they patched that bit of brotherly malfeasance up. But yeah, and continuing into the losing streak this song kind of had, Marvin almost didn't sing it. He said he wanted to give the tune to a vocal group he was producing for Motown called the Originals, which is probably one of the most used band names in
the new Originals.
Yeah. And Obie Benson stridently disagreed and gave him an ultimatum, which he said, I'll give you a percentage of the tune if you sing it, but if you do it for anybody else, you can't have none of it.
I mean, Obie was like, you know what? This will be a huge song if you do it, and I will make a lot of money because this was originally my song. And if you try to give it to anybody else and it's basically a flop and a waste of a song, then I'm taking the song back. So you got to do it, which is Kind of amazing. I mean, one of the great songs about social justice and income equality came about due to sheer avarice on Marvin Gaye's part. Like, oh, if I can't have a percentage of it, if I give it to anybody else. So, shoot, I guess I'll just do it. Just kidding. I'm sure he thought it was a good song. So, Marvin Gaye enters Motown's famous Hitsville studio in Detroit to record the song on June 1st, 1970. And this marked his first true full-scale independent production. He'd recently produced the originals, and he was emboldened by this experience, so he wanted to take a shot at this track rather than relying on one of Motown's, crack team of in-house producers. He paid for the session himself and even hired his own non-Motown musicians, which is, Motown is such an insular company. That was a pretty radical act to bring in outsiders, including members of the Detroit Symphony. And he even invited some of his friends from the Detroit Lions to come in and add to the street chatter at the beginning of the song. And really, he wanted it to stay away from anything that resembled the traditional Motown sound, which, at this point had become, I say formulaic. I don't mean that as an insult.
But it was.
But it absolutely was. Yeah.
We were just looking this up. It was open 22 hours a day. They closed it for 2 hours to clean it. It was a factory.
Yeah. So he really wanted to try to break away from that. And so he brought in a big band drummer named Chet Forrest to make sure it didn't have that standard, R&B, four on the floor Motown beat that the label had become famous for. He had this whole army of percussionists on the floor of Studio A, which they called the Snake Pit, the live room. Jack Ashford on tambourine, Eddie Brown on bongos and congas, Earl DeRuin on congas, and Jack Brokenshaw on vibes and assorted percussive toys. And these were heavy hitters. These were guys who played with jazz legends like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. And, Marvin was down there in the Snake Pit right alongside him, playing piano and leading the rhythm section. And, it's a shame because there are all these great musicians around, but no one could see each other because apparently the air was so thick with pot smoke. Marvin, it's well known, liked to spark a joint on occasion. And yeah, it's fair to say that weed was fairly plentiful in the studio, which, was not all that unusual in 1970. But it's unusual that the sound of someone smoking a joint actually made it onto the final take. During the studio chatter and the fade of the song, there's like a long, sustained intake of breath, which is the unmistakable sound of doobie hitting. Is that how one phrases that?
That's hip.
Yeah, thank you.
Your hip jive patter.
Yeah. I clearly know what's going on.
Yeah, but Snake Pit's so funny, man. I've done that tour. It's truly one of the precursors to DIY, like indie culture. Like, yep, just throw stuff in the basement and go from there. Because there's also like a chute up to the attic, and that was how they would get some of the vocal reverb, was by
like an old laundry chute.
Basically, yeah, like singing up into it. It's so cool that they just did everything out of that house.
Is it small? Like, I've never been. Is it? Wow.
Small house. Not like he didn't buy what they call the Motown mansion until 1967, and then all of the Hitsville stuff was
moved out to LA, right?
Yeah, and then destroyed the label.
Yeah, no, pretty much. And while we're on the topic of people, I guess I'll say overindulging, this brings us to my favorite story of the What's Going On sessions. Marvin really wanted the Motown bassist James Jamerson to play on What's Going On, and why wouldn't he? The dude is one of the greatest bassists in history, providing the groove for a truly ridiculous number of Motown hits. You got My Girl, you got You Can't Hurry Love, Dancing in the Streets, For Once in My Life, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Reach Out and I'll Be There. As a session musician, he played on 23 Billboard Hot #1 hits, a record only narrowly surpassed by Sir Paul McCartney, who's cited him as an influence.
He is where it's not an exaggeration to say he revolutionized bass playing. Before this, you had like upright bass, and he was an upright bassist. He was a jazz bassist, so he had a tremendous.
He was an upright guy?
Yeah.
Wow.
He had it. So he was a jazz bassist, and a lot of these guys were jazz musicians. They used to record all day and then go out and hit jams, after-hour jams. So just a tremendously just physical faculty on the instrument, right? But then just the innovations he brought to harmony and rhythm. Yeah, it's like him and Jaco Pastorius, who are like true revolutionaries of that instrument. And like, I guess like Jack Bruce and John Entwistle at a very distant third. But they're British. They can't play bass.
Oh, What about Sir Paul? What about my beloved Macca?
He's fine. Yeah, he's fine. He's got some moves. But I mean, you cannot undersell James. Like and the bass line to this song, my one bass teacher was like, you couldn't get work after this bass line came out if you hadn't like transcribed it and played it. He was like, that was like the audition piece for every gigging bassist after a while, like, because it was just like the gauntlet had been thrown, you know?
Now, I mean, you are a much better. I dabble in bass. I played bass in your band, but you are a serious. Thank you. That's very kind of you. But you are a serious classically trained bass player. Is it a complex bass line in this song?
Yeah, I mean, without getting too in the weeds about it, he uses all these passing tones. Like bass playing was so just using like root, fifth, root, third, just outlining the chords very simply. And he adds all these non-chord tones, these passing tones that are on like the different parts of the beat. And he just does it in such an instinctual way that's so natural. You hear like so many other different bassists have just taken their entire bag of tricks from James and really this bass line. I mean, and now that we've talked about it, like it's like the lodestar and like the 10 Commandments on the mountain. Tell us how it came about.
Yes, he was so drunk that he couldn't sit in a chair and was flat on his back on the floor of the studio when he came up with this revolutionary bass line. And there are two versions of how this came to be, and I love them both, and I'll share them both with you. And I wish they could both exist. The first version I had heard was that, you mentioned earlier that these old jazz guys love to go out at night and go gigging. And Marvin, I guess, forgot to book Jamerson. I'm not really sure what happened, but was desperately trying to track him down. So he just hit every dive bar and like seedy club in town looking for Jamerson. And there he was on stage, just basically blackout, and brought him along to the studio, plunked him in a chair, but he had trouble even sitting in the chair. So he just reclined on the studio floor and made magic. The slightly more likely version I heard was that Marvin was out and ran into him before going to the session, and he was, doing a gig on stage at some club and said, "Oh yeah, when you're done, come by the studio afterwards. We're working on a track." And then he just showed up, blackout out of his mind.
The other thing that the guys talk about in Standing in the Shadows is fortunate that this did not make it into the session, because apparently Jamerson's other habit that pissed everyone off was smoking cigars and eating pig's feet while they were like touring around in these sedans. And like, I mean, there was like 4 or 5 guys piled into a car, and Jamerson would be smoking cigars and eating pickled pig's feet out of like paper bags. And everyone's like, "You're lucky you're a genius, because we cannot deal with you."
I mean, didn't he also used to keep like some like ouzo or something?
I hadn't heard this. This was a new one for me.
Yeah, he kept like a bottle, like a really intense Greek spirit in his bass case. It would kill like a decent amount of it during a session. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point that he died of cirrhosis of the liver at a very young age. I think like 47 or something. So he knew how to put it away. So he must have had a serious amount if he couldn't even sit properly. But it is amazing that, I mean, clearly music comes from a different part of the brain. With Alzheimer's patients, one of the last things that they remember are songs from, different points in their lives too. So it really is interesting to think, like, I mean, I know that
every other part of his brain was shut down, but he was like, "No, I can still rip."
In my reptilian brain. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely an interesting neurological experiment, the Jamerson bass part for what's going on. But yeah, incredible historic bass line, done, blackout drunk on the floor of the studio. Incredible. Just so incredible. It was sweet. I guess like he very rarely talked about his work with his wife, but I guess when he got home from the studio that night, he I guess sobered up enough to say to his wife, "I just worked on a masterpiece," and he was just gushing about it. And she would later say it was rare that he would ever discuss his work so passionately with her. So
that's so great.
He knew at the time that this was something special. So yeah, James Jamerson created that insane bass line while drunk on the floor. There's another crucial part of the song that sprung from this loose and laid-back atmosphere, that lonely, haunting alto sax intro, which is just, I chills going up my spine right now just thinking about it. It's so sad. It's so lonely. It's so haunting. Something like 8 different sax players have claimed credit for it over the years, but it was played by Eli Fontaine, who was just warming up. That line he played was just him messing around. He had no intention whatsoever for that to be recorded. He was just getting loose and getting his reed wet. And he signaled to Marvin that he was ready to roll, and Marvin told him to just go home. They had what they needed.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, and he was just like, well, what do you mean? I was just goofing around. And Marvin replied, I love this. Well, you goof exquisitely.
Yeah, that's such a great line.
I can just hear Marvin say that in his incredibly cool, quiet, high-pitched Marvin speaking voice. It's so cool. You goof exquisitely. Thank you. I love that. And while we're on the topic of just sort of accidents and how they came together to make this such an amazing song, you have Marvin Gaye's sort of trademark double vocals in the song, like a lot of his scat parts where there's 2 vocal parts that kind of weave in and out of each other. And it sounds so tight and so intricate that you would assume that it would take a significant amount of arrangement and planning to get it to sound that good. Not the case at all. Those multi-layered vocal parts, which, became his trademark later.
Yeah, it's like D'Angelo's whole thing, too, is having like 11 different D'Angelo takes on any given song.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that Marvin would revisit again and again and again. And this wasn't intentional. It was an accident. Marvin had asked to hear a playback of what's going on in the studio, and he asked an engineer to make a tape with 2 different versions of his vocals so that he could switch back, fade in one, fade out the other, and listen to them both and try to hear which one he liked best. And the engineer, by mistake, mixed them onto one tape so that you heard both parts playing at once. And Marvin liked it. Initially he was listening just to try to compare and see which one he liked better, but hearing both at once, he thought that was actually the best way to go. And that was something that he would kind of expand on for the rest of his career and do these multi-layered 3, 4, 5 vocal part harmonies with himself.
Yeah, so perhaps sort of going along with his like political awakening, Marvin Gaye started changing his vocal style in the late 60s. I guess some of it had to do with being coached to sound more like Norman Whitfield. And this goes into the Motown thing of being like, they would always put songs slightly out of people's comfortable vocal register to give it that like
interesting
pleading aspect to it. And so Gaye said after listening to David Ruffin and Levi Stubbs, who are some of the famous like passionate Motown shouters, he said he started to develop what he called his tough man voice. He's saying intentionally putting a growl onto his lower register. And there's a guy named Rob Bowman who wrote liner notes to this DVD of collected Marvin Gaye performances. And he says that the recording of What's Going On is the first that Marvin has his 3 voices that are all appearing in one song, which is this lower register growl, his really unaffected high tenor, and then his falsetto.
That's really interesting. Wow.
Super cool, man. Marvin Gaye's incredible. And then speaking of voices on this record and things that they would later go on to do, I love this bit so much. So the other big part of the, you might even say the studio was its own instrument on this recording. But I mean, it sounds like a party, right?
Yeah,
it's like
when
such
it
a
opens,
loose,
you
it's
hear
such
that,
a,
hey, what's happening?
Yeah. And to add to that, he basically had a bunch of people come in and ad-lib like pitter-patter, like rhubarb. No, they didn't say rhubarb. That's like isn't that what they tell like extras to like be mouthing and talking in the background of shots?
I've never heard that.
It's something I heard somewhere. Yeah, so he brings in a bunch of people, not all of whom, not many of them, I don't think any of them are professional singers.
I mean, yeah, they're his NFL buddies and like guys
his
around the Motown
buddies.
office.
And some of the people who are on there as singers are Detroit Lions players Mel Farr and Lem Barney, some of the different Funk Brothers, the backing band, the session guys who were not vocalists by trade, and a Motown staffer named L.G. Stover. And L.G. is the man who says, hey man, what's happening? And he says, everything is everything. And he has co-writes on Flying High in the Friendly Sky and God is Love. But his lasting contribution to the world, other than this, is his ribs. He had a roadside grill in Hilton Head, South Carolina, that was a favorite of Bill Clinton's. And so whenever Bill Clinton was in the area, the Secret Service agents would bring
Shovel him
LG's
over.
pork ribs over to Bill, and they made him an honorary member of the 547th Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit. Because, Jordan?
Because his ribs were good enough to blast the explosive-sniffing dogs from their appointed duties. Or you could be taken as giving them explosive bowel problems. I'm not really sure which I prefer the kind version better.
Yeah.
But yeah, he used to say to his customers, "I'm LG Stover, the Black Casanova, known for his ribs the world all over." God bless you, LG, for all you've given us.
Mm.
And having said all that, we'll be right back with more Too Much Information right after this.
We're getting into Berry Gordy territory now next.
Oh,
but
warning.
Yeah.
Bummer ahead.
Yeah. Marvin knew what he had on his hands, and he was so excited to play it for Berry Gordy, and Berry Gordy was not thrilled. Now, we talked a little bit about Berry being this father figure to Marvin.
Wait, before we get into that,
go ahead.
Marvin sought him out on his vacation. He was so excited that he couldn't wait.
At the Bahamas,
and he tracked him down to the Bahamas to play him this song, which makes it so much worse that Barry hated it. Like, Marvin had come all this way, like a kid wanting to please his dad with this thing that he had made. And the dad said, I think the quote was, "This is the worst thing I've ever heard in my life."
I mean, it does make sense because everything is was so controlled within an inch of its life at Motown. And even just like sonically, it must have sounded to him like a pseudo psychedelic band and not like that dry, crisp, very bare bones kind of Motown sound. Like even the stuff that has like the string quartet on it does not sound murky. It doesn't sound like a party. It sounds like a Detroit car, precision engineered. So to get this sprawling, weird, loosey-goosey thing, I mean, I get why he wouldn't like it, but...
Well, it's weird. He actually said that he thought that it sounded old-fashioned.
Which is bizarre and incorrect.
He thought that the scat sounded old, like an old Dizzy Gillespie style, scat thing. So he didn't like the kind of jazziness of it, too. So I'm sure it was both. I'm sure he thought that the actual like acoustics of it were kind of murky psychedelia, but also the chordal structures and all the scat singing and stuff he did, he thought sounded like an old big band jazz stuff. I mean, he got the big band drummer guys, Chet Forrest. So
I mean, at least he was consistent because he also came after the Temptations for doing Ball of Confusion. They were dipping their toe in the waters of social awareness with their music.
Yeah, I mean, he'd worked so hard to create this brand that was kind of for everybody. And yeah, he'd been dragging his feet for so long on making even the most tame social comments. I mean, you mentioned Ball of Confusion, Temptations, War, the Edwin Starr song. He wouldn't let the Temptations do that song because he was afraid that it was gonna, alienate their listeners. So they gave it to Edwin Starr, who was like a, second tier, no offense, Edwin Starr, Motown artist. And it became... I think it went to number one. I mean, it became a huge hit.
That song rules.
Oh, yeah. It's an incredible song. And, just to show where Berry Gordy was at, he had just co-written ABC for the Jackson 5.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean...
It's practically a nursery rhyme.
I mean, it is a nursery rhyme. It's the most bubblegum sound in the world. I mean, Motown billed itself as the sound of young America. That's what they had printed on, all the record sleeves and stuff. And what Marvin was doing was now the sound of young America, and Berry wasn't willing to move in that direction. And his reaction to what's going on was basically, I mean, to keep building on this father-son metaphor, was like a father whose favored son had rejected an Ivy League scholarship and decided to go join a rock band or something. It was like, why do you want to ruin your career? You are basically like a modern-day Nat King Cole. You are this widely accepted cross-racial figure. Why do you want to go out and rock the boat on this? And so, I mean, there's this great story about Berry Gordy when he was a little kid. To make a few bucks, he sold newspapers. The papers that he sold were written for black people. He sold them in black neighborhoods. And then one day he decided to see what would happen if he went to white neighborhoods to sell this, supposedly black newspaper there. And he doubled his money. So he was thrilled about this. He had, as a kid, he had a crossover hit on his hand with this newspaper. So he told all his friends, and they went back to this white neighborhood as a group. And the next day, they sold nothing. And he said it was an important lesson. 1, black kid is cute. 2 is a threat. And I think that this incident instilled in him this desire to cross over into white communities, but also be very aware of the tensions and the code of behavior that it would take to do so. He was also a boxer as a kid, which, gives some indication of his approach to business. He's very steely. And one of his first entrepreneurial ventures was a record store that stocked highbrow jazz. That was really the kind of music that he loved. And he quickly learned that people didn't want highbrow jazz, but pop and R&B. And the shop went bust because of it, because he held firm to these, highbrow music tastes that he really personally loved. So I think all 3 of these stories really are crucial to how he ran Motown.
And the fact that Marvin Gaye said he had a short man's complex.
Yes.
Marvin Gaye was like 6 feet tall.
Yes, exactly. I think, the being very aware of how delicate the whole having a crossover product can be, how you do not let your personal tastes, no matter highbrow they are, dictate, you got to go for I hate to say lowest common denominator, but just common taste.
The biggest audience.
And he held to this with the spirit of a boxer.
And don't with the formula.
Yeah. Don't you ever cross me. I mean, Marvin's relationship with Berry Gordy, should we get into this? I mean, it is...
Maybe just the quick cliff notes, because it'll just make me too sad to finish.
I know. I mean, we'll try to go quick. I mean, you almost can't get into Marvin Gaye's relationship with Berry Gordy without at least touching about his extremely troubled relationship with Marvin's own father, Marvin Gaye Sr., who was an abusive, alcoholic Pentecostal preacher who brutally beat him as a boy for just even minor offenses. He would often say to him, "I brought you into this world. I can take you out." And he would say it with utmost sincerity. And spoiler, that's exactly what he did. Marvin was murdered by his father. Balancing the secular with, his Pentecostal upbringing was something that he never really rationalized. I mean, the sacred and the profane existed in the same space in Marvin's head. And he never really, I definitely stole that from something. I think that's from the Marvin Gaye biography, Divided Soul by David Ritz. I can't swear to that. But like you said, you could fill a whole book on Marvin's relationship with his dad, and we won't get into it all here other than to, reiterate the fact that Marvin's dad wound up shooting him to death. So clearly their relationship wasn't great. There's this really sad story where Marvin tried to make his dad proud by giving him a suitcase with $3 million cash. He expected praise, but his father only responded by quoting a biblical passage. "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul?" So yeah, he was never going to really see eye to eye with his father. And Marvin basically reenacts all this twisted paternal turmoil in his relationship with Berry Gordy, who he saw as a father figure in the way that a teenager sees a father figure, which is basically a disciplinarian bent on control and limiting his freedom in favor of old-fashioned, boring ideas. It's really amazing how often daddy issues crop up on this show. I guess that's life. Or at least life in the artistic world.
Yeah.
And Berry Gordy, as soon as Marvin signed to Motown in 1960, he became the major male role model in Marvin's life. Rejecting his own father, Marvin was really influenced by strong men. I mean, these were managers. These were his friends on the NFL teams. And he would tell biographer David Ritz, "I respected Berry Gordy for his guts, but even in the beginning, I knew we were destined to clash. At the same time, I was awed by him. BG, that's what we all called him, was also the coolest dude I'd ever met. Had women like you wouldn't believe. Beautiful, world-class women. Combine that with the talent for making millions, and you get some idea of the impact this guy had on me. This cat was serious." So Marvin knew he needed Berry, and he admired his business acumen and his cunning for, getting through the vicious music marketplace. Everyone was out for number one, Marvin said. Berry, first and foremost. He established himself as a king. He owned us. And I think that's a very telling statement. I mean, this, need for control and business cunning that Marvin really admired about him, he also resented the hell out of, because Berry was, maybe still is, one of the most terrifying autocrats in music history.
Yeah, I mean, Marvin was an artist. He was like a sweet, sensitive boy who loved to sing, and Berry Gordy loved money. And disliked things that would separate him from his money.
Right, yeah. I mean, you mentioned this earlier. Motown was basically like took a cue from the old pre-code movie studios that controlled every aspect of an artist's life. They sent him to like these charm schools and taught these kids from the Detroit projects how to be, quote, acceptable to white audiences. And Marvin rejected all of this almost immediately. And, you know, even at an early stage, he wouldn't allow himself to be packaged into this all-around entertainer mold, which is why he didn't achieve the same kind of success as the Temptations and the Supremes did in the 60s. He just would kind of buck all attempts to be put into that prepackaged mold. And there's a great quote he said years later, "I bitch about us being slaves to the system and stir up all kinds of stuff. But finally, like everyone else, I'd fall in line. Somewhere along in here, don't ask me the time or date, I lost my self-respect."
This is so sad thinking of this immensely talented man just being beaten down by a succession of horrible father figures.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he was very much afraid of Berry Gordy. I mean, just like he was of his actual father. And to prove that he wasn't afraid, he would just act out senselessly and provoke both men whose love and approval he also craved. I guess at one gig, Marvin wouldn't go on. Like, Berry was there and Marvin refused to go on. Berry went backstage and smacked Marvin in the mouth before just cursing him out in front of everybody. And within a few minutes, Marvin was on the stage. And I mean, Berry, he just viewed him like a troubled son. And they would fight. I mean, Motown staffers were horrified one day to see that Berry and Marvin were like literally tussling on the lawn at the Motown studios, just like screaming at each other in the pouring rain. And Berry was like, "I made you a star. I've done everything for you," which is such a dad thing to say.
Yeah, of course.
And because I guess he made the mistake once of calling Marvin boy, which you don't call Marvin boy. That didn't end well. So, I mean, this was just a battle of wills between the autocratic father figure and this strong-willed, emotionally tempestuous artist. And, you know, like I said earlier, Marvin started showing up to interviews carrying copies of books by, you know, Black Panthers or Malcolm X. He sang a version of the Dion song Abraham, Martin, and John, which was about as political as Motown was willing to get in 1968. You know, it references Martin Luther King and RFK's assassinations and the riots across the country. So this really puts the whole "what's going on" standoff into perspective. It's why Berry hated it and refused to release it. But who came to save the day, Heigl?
As he always does. Stevie Wonder, baby.
Yes.
You know, Motown, for anyone who doesn't know, for anyone who's not as big nerds as we are, Motown had a quality control division.
I love that so much.
I mean, the legend that I always heard was that Berry Gordy had like, did he have like a...
It's like a weekly meeting, right?
Well, a meeting, but he had like a car radio, not a stereo, that he would listen to stuff on.
Oh, a lot of people would do that. Brian Wilson would do that too. They wanted to hear how things would sound to the kids that would buy the record. They wanted to hear how it would sound, you know, how most people listen to music in those days on little crappy car radios or transistor radios.
But so what's going on gets in front of the quality control board and presumably with a playback and gets a resounding thumbs down. And Stevie Wonder, who is on his ascent to godhood at this point.
This is right before like Talking Book in 71. And
before he's just about to start crushing it for like a decade. He came to the defense of it. And it's also interesting to note that not only heard it through the grapevine, but also Baby, I'm For Real were also all passes by the QC board.
QC board really wasn't into Marvin's stuff.
Yeah. But you know who else liked it? Was Berry Gordy's sister, who was Marvin's wife.
I want to like take a look at this for a moment. We just went through all the complex father-son Oedipal weirdness issues.
But that's not all.
Surrounding Berry Gordy and Marvin Gaye. Marvin asserted his dominance at Motown in this really quite medieval way by marrying the boss's sister. But the boss in this scenario is also his father figure. So it's sort of like his aunt. But Anna Gordy, Berry's sister, was also 17 years older than Marvin. And by all accounts, was a very maternal figure and took on kind of a maternal role in Marvin's life. So have fun with all that.
A lot of layers. But she was unable to sway Berry to get him to put out the single. So Marvin went on strike. He said, put out what's going on, or I'll never record for you again. And Gordy then asked Smokey Robinson, who was Motown's vice president, one of its biggest stars. He said, can you change his mind? And Robinson said, Like a bear shitting in the woods, Marvin ain't budging, which I love.
That should have been a song.
Yeah.
That should have been an early, it sounds like an early Miracle song.
Well, so Gaye and Smokey were really close friends, and I just read this quote that Gaye was talking about Smokey, or talking about what's going on, and he said, God is writing this album. God is working through me to make what's going on. So maybe that had to do with the bear shitting analogy.
The sacred and profane, as I said.
At a crossroads. But yeah, and he followed through on it. He didn't release anything. He didn't record. And this was hurting himself because he was broke. The IRS was coming after him. Wouldn't be the last time.
No.
And he, could have used a big payday, but stalled like the unstoppable force and the immovable object for over half a year. And as you wrote, our beloved L.G. Stover had a great quote about this. Marvin had heard protesters advising that the only way for an individual to fight the war machine was not to allow his body to be used as an instrument of that war. And this was the way he approached his battle with Motown.
Not really the same thing, but okay. But continue.
The passive resistance preached by Martin Luther King was the only path. He was already a part-time live performer at best. Now he would simply cease recording altogether until What's Going On was released. But they still didn't even technically work because they had to sneak release it.
Yeah, this still really confuses me how you pull one over on Berry Gordy. What's Going On eventually saw the light of day a few months later because an executive went behind Berry Gordy's back to release it. And there are actually two versions of the story, the heroic version and the more practical version. There's a story that was released thanks to a sympathetic Motown executive named Harry Balk. And this guy was sort of a legend at Motown for throwing a tax officer down the stairs during an argument about an audit. So
Rules.
Clearly, you don't mess with Harry Balk. And he believed in What's Going On so strongly that he distributed 100,000 copies to record stores, supposedly behind Berry Gordy's back, which seems like career suicide, possibly actual suicide, because you really don't want to mess with Berry Gordy. Again, former boxer. The other version, which is kind of more practical, is that the label needed a new single from its biggest male star, and What's Going On was simply the only one that they had, and they just bit the bullet and went with it. Kind of questionable, because I feel like there's a lot of unreleased Motown stuff. In recent years, they've gone chronologically and released a whole box set of like unreleased Motown stuff. So I would imagine they must have had something in the vault from him, but maybe not. Whatever the case, the single was released in January of 1971. I guess when Berry Gordy was taking a flight to LA and he like found out that this had been released like as the flight was taking off. And according to lore, by the time the plane touched down in LA, they had orders out for all of them. The entire run was sold out so fast that they had another 100,000 singles produced within a week. So the worst thing that Berry Gordy had ever heard in his life had become the fastest selling single in the history of Motown.
I love it. There's apparently a couple digs at Berry in this song. The false fade out at the end, which is still a weird thing for a song. It just fades out and comes back. Gaye did it himself. He was, when they were mixing, he was like, we need to do this. I would, and did it to mess with Berry Gordy.
Yeah, he just reached over to the fader and like switched it back up again for a second.
And then the guy who engineered it, Steve Smith, said, it was Marvin's mind trip, his way of saying F you to the company, and I think more so to Berry Gordy. You think this song you hate is over? Surprise!
I love that. I love that so much. But What's Going On became a global smash and his biggest hit to date. And Berry Gordy, being a businessman first and foremost, totally reversed his decision and told Marvin that Motown would now release an album of anything he wanted, provided he could finish it in 30 days. And as a perverse form of encouragement, he made this like a bet. Do it in 30 days. And Marvin did it in 10, supposedly working constant 16-hour days to cut 9 tracks. Neither man ever disclosed what they wagered. I would love to know what the bet was about. But yeah, Berry bet him to do it in 30 days. And he did it in 10, because that's what cocaine is for.
Yeah.
Now, Heigl, you're a vocalist. You're a singer. We were in a band together. And you were the singer. I know that a lot of vocalists have all sorts of unique ways in the studio, like rituals.
Some people light incense.
Yeah.
Some people have a special drink that they drink.
Tell us what Marvin did before he would do his vocal takes.
I mean, there's different. These have been chalked up to different reasons for doing this, but not only
there's really only one reason for doing this, but go on.
Well, the joints. We talked about his habit of chain smoking joints. There was a lot of scotch flowing through the sessions as well. But according to Dorian Lynskey in 33 Revolutions Per Minute, History of Protest Songs, Marvin Gaye would masturbate at length.
This is a quote.
Before vocal takes in order to drain himself of carnal distraction. Which, yeah, I mean, like, you know, the rest of Marvin Gaye's discography is pretty horny. So he was like,
I need to focus on social issues. And then when all that was out of the way, then he made Let's Get It On, next record.
yeah, I mean, good Lord. How masturbate for hours?
Where are you reading? I just hear that coming through my headphones.
Masturbate for hours.
Is that what it
I don't
says?
know, at length? What do you consider at length? 40 minutes? 45 minutes? I mean, I guess
Depends on how many people are waiting.
Marvin!
Knock, knock, knock. We're ready to go. I mean, we were talking about this earlier.
Masturbating at length?
No, we were talking about vocal take rituals. Have you heard of any good ones? I know you mentioned Beyonce.
Well, Beyonce supposedly doesn't let anyone in the entire studio. They just she has the engineer in there and the lights are off and she goes in by herself. I mean, the one that isn't there's a Guns N' Roses take where Axl Rose is having sex with someone in the booth or getting
There's a lot of
job. Yeah.
There's a Doors song, I think Your Lost Little Girl, where I think that was
yes,
done
the other
as well.
Jim Morrison in bathrooms, unsurprisingly. Didn't he do Roadhouse Blues on the toilet?
Oh yeah, that was when they were recording LA Woman at their workshop.
Yeah.
And they just turned their bathroom into an impromptu vocal booth.
Great
Yeah.
reverb. That's why everyone sounds good in the shower.
That's where Lennon and McCartney, when they were kids, used to sing in the
And
in the
masturbate
in the
at
McCartney-
length.
Yeah, they used to have their Sun Records slapback echo up in the upstairs McCartney family bathroom with
Is that what you call
slapback echo?
Hey-o! All right, moving on. I have no segue for this, but we have to stop talking about whacking it. Motown's first gatefold cover.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh wow!
And that cover shot of him, sort of looking pensively off in the middle distance, was very nearly rejected because you could see too far up his nose. Photographer Jim Hayden took Marvin's portrait at his Detroit home on Outer Drive. It started to snow, made his hair turn white. He has that
cool shot.
Yeah, he's got that great trench coat. But the Motown creative director Tom Schlesinger rejected it because you could see way too far up Marvin's nose. And Marvin,
how far is too far up?
That's a great question. I mean, it's my second favorite bit of rock and roll nose apocrypha, coming after they had to rotoscope Neil Young's Coke Booger out of The Last Waltz. Yeah, but again, as with many other, as we're beginning to see as a trend, Marvin put his foot down and said, nope, that's the cover shot. Deal with it. I'm trying to think whatever else this guy shot.
I'm trying to think of other rock and roll nose stories.
Well, who didn't Stevie Nicks almost deviate? She deviated her septum doing so much coke.
Oh, I think that's a common.
Yeah. What else you got?
I mean, Michael Jackson.
Oh God,
we're not going there.
Nope.
The other side of Motown nose stories. We're gonna take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Too Much Information in just a moment.
So yeah, this is Motown's first gatefold cover. A couple other firsts regarding the cover. First time that musicians were credited. Motown famously did not credit these guys, the Funk Brothers, the people who played on all of these. They left all the session players anonymous. The songwriting credits were chalked up to the committee.
That's haunting.
Yeah, it sounds vaguely sinister.
Well, no, they used to credit them, and then I think in the late '60s or early '70s, there was some kind of mini revolt among the songwriters at Motown.
Well, yeah, that's when the Holland Dozier Holland left.
Yeah, I think that was what it was that people started recognizing the songwriters individually. It was a rare bit of individuality in the Motown homogeny that people started to recognize what songwriters were writing hits, and they became more in demand. So then spiteful Berry Gordy started crediting songs to the committee more as a giant middle finger to these songwriters, I think, than actually a serious corporate decision.
And you're the one who disputes the credit thing, right? You said there's a Valerie Simpson side that printed the actual names of the guys on there?
Yeah, there was an obscure Valerie Simpson album just before What's Going On came out that credited all the musicians who played on it. And but Marvin was definitely somebody who helped popularize this practice of crediting the session guys.
I mean, he put a bunch of people on here. I love this Good Will Hunting joke about the janitor at Motown. He credited this guy for writing Inner City Blues. If you go through the liner notes, you'll see there's a line in there that says, "Thanks to James Nix, a gentleman and a scholar," parentheses, "which I'm apparently not." And that is in honor of this gentleman, James Nix, who's a janitor at the Motown offices and who wanted to be a songwriter. And after Gaye wrote the melody for Inner City Blues, Nix came up with these lyrics about the have-nots of America, which he saw after reading a newspaper headline about the inner city of Detroit. He also has co-writing credits on What's Happening, Brother and God is Love. And this really came back in a big way in the 80s when people started sampling this stuff and got him some pretty big paychecks.
Yeah, it's interesting to see who Marvin included in his dedications, and probably more interesting to see who he didn't include. Marvin shouted out his parents, his family, his close business associates, but Berry Gordy, not mentioned. No thanks, no anything. So just to recap, Marvin Gaye thanked his future murderer, but not Berry Gordy.
There's a line in here that I was maybe a jab at his dad, or a couple of them. Father, we don't need to escalate. Could be about God, could also be about Marvin Gaye's dad. There's another line in here. In God is Love, when he says, "Love your mother, she bore you. Love your father, he works for you." And some people have posited that was a dig at his dad, who was kind of underemployed through his childhood, and that his mom ended up supporting them.
Yeah, that's right. I have heard that about. Yeah, their whole
just sighing heavily throughout this whole thing as we know how the Marvin Gaye story. Side note, why has no one made a Marvin Gaye biopic, man? Is it because Walk Hard came out and killed the music biopic, like completely dead?
I mean, it could be like a licensing or like a states thing too.
Sure.
I could imagine that being. I mean, think of these are the people that sued Robin Thicke for Blurred Lines
for a vibe.
For inappropriately co-opting the vibe of Got to Give It Up. So I would imagine they would be a fairly litigious bunch and maybe didn't really, because as much as I love Marvin Gaye, and I really, really do, the thought of sitting through a full movie about his life would just be such a colossal bummer.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, even just getting through Here, My Dear, and then getting out on the other side of Here, My Dear. Oh,
yeah. The most haunting thing, I mean, when Marvin's dad shot him on, I think the day before his 45th birthday in 1984, and the police hauled him in and basically asked him to characterize his relationship with his son. And they've asked him point blank, "Did you love him?" And his dad said, "Well, let's just say I didn't dislike him." So, yeah, let's just maybe stick to YouTube clips.
You're the one who showed me that like piano of him like just playing the piano and singing along with that.
Oh, man. Yeah, for anyone who hasn't seen this, there's this amazing clip. I don't remember. It was some concert film of him, I think, performing in Belgium in the early 80s.
Yeah.
And he's just in the empty auditorium before anyone gets there, not even doing sound checks. I think he's just seeing the place, and there's a baby grand out on the stage. And he just sits down and just starts ripping for like 7 minutes. He does this medley, Come Get to This, into Distant Lover. And it is just the best. Like, please go check that out now. It is so great. It's like it's easily my favorite Marvin Gaye performance clip.
Also a drummer, like he drummed for the Miracles on the road. Like,
yeah.
Just such a polymath, genius guy. Despite all of that, What's Going On? Not well received by the RIAA.
Yes. What's Going On? The album matched the success of the title song that was released as a single. It became the fastest selling album in Motown's history. Broke ground as Motown's first concept album, paving the way for acts like Stevie Wonder and Barry White. But despite all this, What's Going On? Not nominated for a single Grammy.
But what was?
Carole King dominated that year with Tapestry.
Yeah. I have no quarrel with Carole King, but
No.
that still feels unfair. They should have made some room for Marvin.
I know. And he really, in the category that he really expected to dominate, the best rhythm and blues male performance, Lou Rawls won. And 10 years later, when Marvin Gaye was talking to his biographer, David Ritz, he was still pissed off about this. He said, Lou had gotten it before, and I never had. Not in 11 years I've been making records. I knew it was my time, but it wasn't. I was deeply hurt by the whole affair. I felt like I was swindled. I was mad at Lou. I didn't like the way he handled it, and if I hadn't watched myself, I could have wound up fighting him. That's how pissed I was. I thought I turned out a great work, and the Grammys didn't even give me the time of day. Politics, that's what it was. Hollywood games. I refused to play those games, and I suffered.
He shouldn't have taken it out on Lou Rawls. Lou Rawls is the best.
I mean, that's a very telling line. I refused to play those games, and I suffered. I mean, that's a very interesting summation of his career, if not his life.
But, he successfully stared into the raging maw of Berry Gordy and came out on top. He renegotiated his contract with Motown over this.
I mean, as well he should have.
Yeah.
I think it was the most lucrative deal by a black recording artist ever at that time. And he would only accept the contract if Berry signed the check personally. A Motown lackey had to drive to the airport to catch Berry Gordy before he took off on a flight to Europe to get his signature. No one else's signature would do it. Had to be Berry's. And then Marvin blew the check up into one of those oversized novelty Publishers Clearinghouse style checks. And he had it framed above the fireplace in his house, which is like a kid putting his report card on the fridge. I mean, it on one hand, it's adorable. It's also deeply, deeply sad and troubling for a 3-year-old man to do that.
He gave some gold records to the Lions guys, which I also read. Yeah, his whole thing about keepsakes is very endearing.
He's said of this whole Checkgate thing. I was getting more control, and I was determined to be richer than Berry himself. That's always been a goal of mine. It's hard to describe how competitive I felt towards Berry Gordy. And money, as most people say, doesn't buy happiness. And Marvin found that out many times over. In later years, he would always be asked by people, when are you going to do another What's Going On? And he'd say, when I get that depressed. His whole MO was to just sort of wallow in his own misery and use that as fuel for his art. He has a great quote that's, I say great. I mean haunting. Artists suffer so you don't have to. And that pretty much sums it up. There's another line in that David Ritz book, Divided Soul, which is fantastic if you haven't checked it out. And this is David Ritz, the author, writing. By design, Marvin's suffering soul became his most powerful source of artistic inspiration. Closely identifying with Jesus, Gaye saw himself as a martyr, a man whose pain could be converted into artistic statements of real worth. In that sense, he triumphed. Where he failed, though, where he so desperately wanted to succeed, was in creating a happy family.
Oof. Yeah, it's interesting. He knew he had something with this, and apparently got hung up on it in different ways. There's a demo that you can hear of a song that ultimately never got released, where he's in the studio working on a vocal melody, and rather than using vocalese or whatever, he's just repeating the phrase "what's going on" over and over again to work out this vocal melody. So clearly something about this stuck with him,
Wow. When was this?
There's a 1970 demo that's out there of a track called Symphony, and it was never released on an album. And it's just whenever he would get stuck for words, he would just start repeating "what's going on."
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting because you were saying earlier he never performed this live, which that doesn't sound right. Do you mean the full album?
I think Oh yeah, so the album was never performed in its entirety.
Oh, okay.
It was only performed once, exactly a year after its release, May 1st, 1972, in DC, which is
Marvin Gaye Day. Yes, we're dropping this episode as close to May 1st as possible because it's the 50th anniversary of Marvin Gaye Day, which Marvin's hometown of Washington, D.C. declared in his honor back in 1972. Marvin performed during these festivities, marking the first and I believe only time that his father ever saw him perform in concert. And it was the only time that he ever felt that his father was truly proud of him, he would later say.
And during the performance, they played What's Going On twice because the people demanded it.
Oh,
What a great tune, man.
yeah. And, for a guy who had trouble feeling love and acceptance, it feels appropriate to remember him on this day. It's an obscure one in terms of music history, but an important one for him. So we honor Marvin Gaye. We honor What's Going On.
And we thank you for taking this journey with us.
Is that it? I think that's. I think that is What's Going On.
Oh, how long did it take you to get to that?
0.08 seconds.
Anyway, I'm Alex Heigl.
And I'm Jordan Runtagh. Thanks so much for listening. Too Much Information was a production of iHeartRadio.
The show's executive producers are Noel Brown and Jordan Runtagh.
The supervising producer is Mike Johns.
The show was researched, written, and hosted by Jordan Runtagh and Alex Heigl.
With original music by Seth Applebaum and the Ghost Funk Orchestra. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. For more podcasts on iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.
Mm-hmm.